Holly is the latest novel by the one and only Stephen King. It follows private detective Holly Gibney as she investigates the disappearance of a young woman, and in a way only Stephen King can dream up. This gets pretty disturbing. But before I go on, it's important to mention this is not the introduction to Holly. So before you read this, there is a few things that you might want to know. Now, if you're already familiar with Holly's backstory, I'll leave a timestamp below so you can just skip right to the review. But as for the rest of you, allow me to explain a little bit about Holly's backstory and give you a brief overview of all the books she's been in so far. Holly Gibney made her first appearance in Mr. Mercedes, which is the first of what's referred to as the Bill Hodges trilogy. Bill Hodges here is a retired police detective who finds himself involved in a case trying to track down a crazed killer who drove a Mercedes into a crowd of people, killing dozens. Holly Gibney here is the daughter of the woman whose Mercedes was stolen for the incident. So she's kind of involved with the case loosely, but she ends up being a lot more helpful than Hodges ever anticipated. He's so impressed with her detective work that he actually offers her a position at his new private investigation business called, oddly enough, Finders Keepers. Here, Holly and Hodges work together to solve a case involving an obsessed fan who breaks into an author's home, kills him, and takes his unfinished novels. Often in the world of King, authors and crazed fans just find a way of existing.
I'm your number one fan.
Other than the main characters, nothing here directly relates to Mr. Mercedes. The story is pretty much a standalone in the trilogy. The third book, however, End of Watch, sees the return of the original killer from Mr. Mercedes. It introduces some supernatural elements, which can be a bit startling if you're not expecting it. So if you do want to read all three, just be aware that the third book goes there. After the trilogy, there's The Outsider. Now, this book actually has nothing to do with Bill Hodges. Holly is called on by another detective in another city altogether to help with a case where the primary suspect of a murder has, let me just say, very convincing evidence for him and against him at the same time. Anyway, this detective can't really make heads or tails out of the situation, and it really is up to Holly to figure it out. This is her first big opportunity to be at the forefront of an investigation rather than just being kind of there to help. So this book is absolutely important for Holly's growth as a character. Next, there's If It Bleeds, which is actually one of several short stories inside a compilation. In here, Holly is involved in another case that is very similar to what happens in The Outsider. So in that way, this almost acts as an epilogue to The Outsider, and the two go really well together. And finally, there's Holly. And you may be wondering, is it okay to read this first? The short answer is yes. This is a standalone story that doesn't really have anything to do with the previous installments, but Holly does refer to situations and characters from the other books. So you can read this out of order, but it comes at the risk of being confusing when it's referring to other people and events that you don't know anything about. Not to mention, if you do decide to go back and read the previous books, this spoils some major events. So if you're just getting into King and Holly, I'd say just start from the beginning and go from there. At the end of this review, by the way, I'm going to go ahead and rank all of these books. Stick around for that. Okay. Holly. All right, I'll go ahead and start with a brief summary that includes some mild spoilers. Nothing beyond the first 50 pages or so. Later, though, I will be going into some specific details that will absolutely ruin your read-through. But don't worry, I'll give you a heads up before I get there. Okay, Holly is told in two separate timelines. At the start, it's a little rocky jumping back and forth, but once you get familiar with the characters, it's an easy read. In the earlier of the two timelines, we follow a retired couple, Emily and Roddy Harris. They used to be professors at the local college. They're very well educated, and they even continue to stay involved with the academic community. On the surface, they seem harmless. In fact, with their age and chronic pain, they come across as more vulnerable than anything else. But this couldn't be further from the truth. They are, in fact, the ones responsible for so many disappearances throughout the years. And they use their age and perceived helplessness to lure in their victims in a way that's similar to Ted Bundy. They act like they're struggling on sides of roads to get their wheelchair into their van. When people come by to help, they're drugged and locked in this crazy couple's basement. So this timeline is the longer of the two. It spans over 10 years, following Roddy and Emily as they abduct several victims. The second timeline takes place during the present, and this is where Holly comes in. She's hired by Penny Dahl, the mother of the most recent victim of the Harrises. At first, Holly thinks this is just a one-off missing person, but during her investigation, she discovers that several people have gone missing over the years under very similar circumstances. But can she connect the dots and discover what Emily and Roddy are up to before it's too late? You'll have to read it to find out. But just let me say, the ending here is one of the better ones I've read in a long time. And that's saying a lot for a King book. Okay, that's more or less the summary in a nutshell. If it seems remotely interesting to you, pick it up. This is a really good book. It's exciting from beginning to end. Holly, as usual, is hilarious and fun to read. And the book is well paced. It just flies by a lot faster than you'd expect for a book over 400 pages. Okay, at this point, I'm going to talk more specifically about what I liked and didn't like. But in order to do that, I've got to go into some more detail about the plot. So if you haven't read this yet, this is a really good time to leave. Just don't forget to come back when you're caught up. So hands down, the best characters in this book are Emily and Roddy. They aren't just kidnappers. They're cannibals. They actually slaughter and eat their victims because they're convinced that consuming human flesh will prolong their own lives. This, of course, is nonsense, but they're just absolutely committed and delusional. I actually wondered if some part of them knows it's nonsense, but they're just using it as an excuse to kill people. Because at no point do they feel bad for what they're doing. Like, you might suspect them to feel at least an ounce of regret, but they don't. Quite the opposite. They absolutely hate their victims, and they take pleasure in ridding the world of people that they see as beneath them. This couple is just absolutely so easy to hate. Yet at the same time, I absolutely loved them. When they're all alone together, they're so sweet. Even after years of marriage, they still care for each other so much, and the love between them is undeniable. At one point, Emily's sciatica is so bad that she can barely get out of bed. So Roddy offers her his last bits of human meat to help her with her pain, even though he himself is suffering from arthritis. His mental capacity declines as the book goes on. He mixes up his words, and sometimes he just doesn't make any sense. But Emily, despite being a retired English professor who holds language in such high regard, she's so patient and understanding of her beloved husband and his diminishing mind. Their relationship is really tender, and I can't help but just enjoy being in their presence. I literally had to remind myself I'm not supposed to like them. These villains are so layered and nuanced. It was so much fun reading them. We also have several chapters from the victims' perspectives, and these were some standout moments as well. Each victim comes to terms with the gravity of their situation in different ways. They bring with them their own histories, and the brief moments we spend with them, we really grow to like them. I found myself rooting for each one to escape. Okay, I want to talk about something that it wasn't bad, but it bugged me. Emily and Roddy would feed off each of their victims for about 3 years before having to go find someone else. And I just didn't buy it. First of all, can meat even be stored that long without going bad? I mean, I guess it can if it's in a freezer. Maybe. Let's just say yes. Meat can be stored for 3 years in a freezer just fine. Then I don't believe there's enough meat on a human body to last for 3 years, especially considering that they're eating some part of their victim every single day. And when it's time for them to start looking for someone else, it's an emergency. Like, they're running low on meat and they're in a panic. These guys had 3 years to plan, and they still just let their supply run out before having someone else lined up. It seems like such a minor thing, but it really bugged me. Whenever I'd read something about them taking a new victim every 3 years, I would just imagine it saying every 3 months. And that it made me feel better about the situation. I don't know, maybe it won't bug you, maybe you'll never notice it, but I did, and it drove me crazy. Barbara, our good friend who also goes back many books, gets a lot of focus here, which I 100% appreciated. I loved her development, and seeing her passion pay off big time was very satisfying. However, her whole story arc was so isolated from everything else, it felt like an afterthought. When Barbara first decided to reach out for help with her poetry, she approached Emily And right away, Emily and Roddy were salivating at this delicious girl who just presented herself on their doorstep. Oh my God, that was such a tense moment. I was worried for Barbara, but at the same time, I was curious to see how Roddy and Emily would go about capturing her. I was anticipating Barbara being the catalyst for Holly's revelation that the old couple were the ones responsible for all the disappearances. But that whole dynamic just evaporated when Barbara changed her mind and decided to get help from someone else. So there I was, thinking Barbara was going to play a key role in discovering these cannibals, but she was completely sidelined. Yes, she does put 2 and 2 together by the end, and she's the one who rescues Holly, but I wanted more. Okay, the last thing I want to touch on is something that the internet is in a frenzy over, and that's... let's just call them the real world people and events that King included here. First, let's address the flu-like virus that took the world by storm. The book takes place in 2021, so of course it's going to mention the virus. But what seems to have people so upset is the magnitude at which it's mentioned. And honestly, it's there a lot. Just about every other chapter mentions it in some way, whether it's the masks, elbow bumps, or vaccination statuses. I can see how some people might think this is too much. But none of this bothers me, because you got to keep in mind, this is all from the perspective of Holly Gibney, an OCD germaphobe. Naturally, she's going to be preoccupied with the virus and masks and not shaking hands and figuring out who is and isn't vaxxed. It all checks out and makes perfect sense for the character. Although, if I had to give this criticism any merit, it would have to be the one-sidedness of the whole situation. It was very clear that if you wear a mask and you've been vaxxed, you're good. Otherwise, you're a problem. I think if King had included at least one prominent, helpful character who also happens to not be vaxxed, that would have gone a long way in helping this book not feel so preachy. Not to mention, challenging Holly to consider her thoughts on the whole matter might have been good for her. And finally, let's talk about the inclusion of a particular former president. King, once again, brings him up more than once. Now, in the past, this has never bothered me. In previous books, these references were few and far between. They seem maybe a little odd in the moment, but those moments fade away just after a few pages. Here, though, it did feel different. I think a conversation near the beginning highlights this. When Holly is starting her investigation, she asks her client, Penny, about her husband. She says the two of them got divorced. He was a supporter of a particular political figure, and she just couldn't handle it. So the two went their separate ways, and he moved to Alaska. This conversation really stuck out to me, and I kept expecting him to show up. Either like fly down to be with Penny, or at the very least call for support. But he's just gone. Like, why bother mentioning him at all? This was a total missed opportunity. You know, it's no secret that King is vehemently against this particular former president. But he can't even give his supporters a break. I think it would have made a tremendous difference if Penny's husband would have come back to be supportive and redeemed himself to her. They could have, for the crisis, saw past their political differences and united to help find their daughter. Instead, King just doubled down on the idea that even supporting this political figure is so toxic. And despite these complaints, I absolutely loved the book, which is refreshing considering his last couple of novels weren't very good. I didn't have a lot of nice things to say about Billy Summers or Fairy Tale, but this was an absolute joy to read. I'm excited about adding it to my collection. Holly, with all of her eccentricities, is as entertaining as ever. Emily and Roddy are among some of the greatest King villains. And even though Barbara's story is so isolated from the rest of the plot, I honestly loved her journey, and she deserves all the success that she got. And because I liked each of these characters and their stories, the book just flew by, and before I knew it, Holly was making her way to the Harris's home for an incredible finale. But how does it compare to the rest of the Holly universe? As promised, I'm going to go ahead and rank all of these books from the worst to the best. But first, I want to remind you that if you like my content and you'd like to support me, you can use the link in the description below to buy me a cup of coffee. Or if you'd prefer to support me in the classroom, I've also included a link to my Amazon wishlist. Now, if you'd rather support me directly, I'm also taking tips through Stream Elements.
Thank you.
And finally, I want to take a moment to plug my second channel, That's Too Bad About Kenny, with the number 2. I use that channel for live streaming video games. I just recently finished up a playthrough of RoboCop Rogue City. He lost a lot more than that with a freaking rocket launcher blowing up in your face. That game was incredible, especially for an old RoboCop fan like me. So I stream every week. Don't be shy. Head on over and say hello. I'd love to chat with you. Okay, now on to the ranking. So coming in last is The Outsider. Now, just because this is last, it doesn't mean it's a terrible book. I enjoyed it. The first couple hundred pages, I was completely hooked. I didn't know how this guy could seem to be in multiple places at the same time, and I was desperate to find out how King would pull it off. Unfortunately, he went supernatural, which normally I wouldn't mind. But in this case, it didn't flow with how the story was being set up. I didn't see it coming, and quite frankly, it felt like an easy way out as opposed to being clever. All right, next up I put If It Bleeds. Here, Holly is tracking down something that is very similar to what's in The Outsider. It's relatively low on my ranking because of the fact that it's so similar to The Outsider. So there's not much in here to make this really stand out as a unique story. But my ranking is higher than The Outsider because of the fact that it's shorter, so it doesn't take as much time to read. Also, the supernatural elements in here are introduced a lot more naturally, and the story just flows better. All right, for my next book, I have End of Watch. For this one, I'm also going to focus on the supernatural elements. There's a psychic connection that the killer establishes with his victims through games they play on their phone and tablet. As a book, the supernatural elements here are fine. They were introduced early and they flow well. The problem is, this is the final installment of a trilogy that so far has had nothing to do with anything supernatural. So even though I liked this book, it was just too out of place. And for that reason, I don't think it was a good conclusion to the Bill Hodges trilogy. Okay, coming in at number 3 is Holly. And what can I say other than everything that I already said? This is a fantastic book, and I really hope that we haven't seen the last of Holly Gibney. All right, number 2, Mr. Mercedes. This is the book that started the franchise. It introduces all the characters we've grown to love. Bill Hodges, Jerome, Barbara, and yes, Holly too. It's also one of King's first, if not the first, venture into crime novels. His format's a little different than traditional crime novels in that he tells you who the killer is right away, which takes a bit of the mystery out of it. But being able to see the world through the bad guy more than makes up for it. Some of the most memorable moments here in Mr. Mercedes was from the perspective of Brady Hartsfield himself. Much like how some of Holly's most memorable moments were from the perspective of Emily and Roddy. Okay, and my favorite, Finders Keepers. As much as I loved Mr. Mercedes, and I do, I like Finders Keepers more for a few reasons. First of all, the pacing here is a lot better. All the characters have already been introduced, so there's no need for long introductions. As soon as the crimes start happening, Bill and Holly are right on the case. The victims in here weren't as faceless as they were in Mr. Mercedes. In Mr. Mercedes, the victims were, several people in a crowd at a job fair, and later on an audience at a pop concert. The situations were terrifying, but vague. And I think deliberately so, but even still, I like the way King did it better here. In Finders Keepers, the victims are individuals. The first victim is an author whose house gets broken into, and by the end, the killer turns his sights on a young boy who accidentally gets caught up in the whole mess. So I just felt the peril here much more. Also, you know how sometimes in sequels, it just seems weird or unlikely that someone involved in an extraordinary situation somehow is involved in another extraordinary situation? Well, in this case, Bill Hodges starts up his own private investigation business. So it makes a lot of sense that these extraordinary situations would come to him. So I like that move a lot. It just made everything seem so much more credible. And there it is. Thanks for watching my review and my rankings. Goodbye.
Too bad about Kenny, huh? Life in the big city.